Wow, that was absolutely phenomenal. That song always messes me up, and it's kind of not fair to even play that before we start speaking because now that music is in my head and I'm praising God and worshiping Him for His mercy, which endured forever. And I'm just so honored and privileged to be able to share in this space with you all today. We are happy to be back for Roundtable number 6, and we are absolutely delighted that you've chosen to indulge us for at least 6 times. And Dave and I, just like Dane oftentimes is working behind the scenes, doing the Zoom worship. We've been talking to our attorneys, and I think that we've got approval to go ahead and look at that quarterly commitment. And so we're on the same page today, and that's a good thing. We're going to let Dave say something quickly, then we'll get right into the conversation.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to say quickly that I would be remiss if I didn't make a small correction to Dane's wonderful introduction. The people on the south side of Chicago would rise up and kill me if I didn't claim Shiloh Academy instead of Georgia Cumberland Academy. And I see Stephanie is on, and Stephanie was there when I was at Shiloh. So Stephanie, that was Dane, that wasn't me.
Thank you very much.
I will gladly take the heat on that one.
But I hung out with some real cool brothers from GCA during my 4 years at Oakwood, and so I don't run from that affiliation, but I know where home is though. And Janice knows too. Janice knows too. So I gotta rep the south side of Chicago and Shiloh Academy.
Well, thank you, bro. I appreciate that. And hey, it's all one family, and we certainly appreciate that. So as I said last week and the week before, that Dave and I always take the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about what direction we may take this conversation in, because there really is so much going on and so many ways that we can move in this conversation. There are a few things that kind of struck us as an opportunity to share and talk a little bit about some things with you all today in this fellowship space. And the first thing that we wanted to talk about was this Supreme Court decision that was made about affirmative action. And what we want to do is contextualize it in a way that we have been not just thinking about it, but think that provides value for how we move forward from this place. In the space that I operate in, which is the DEI space, and many people have even begun adding a B behind the I for belonging, meaning that this is really a progressive conversation that continues to evolve about how human beings interact with one another. And of course, there's a presumption within the context of faith and Christianity that people automatically come into spaces and get along with each other and love one another and treat everybody right. And even though that is what the intention should be, that's not always what happens in terms of practice. And I'm often asked and sometimes challenged to think about my why as it relates to being in the DEI space, working on human interactions and social engagement and working with people. And my why is simply this, that we were told to occupy until Christ comes again. And my role in the DEI/social justice space is to be mindful about not just my salvation, but the salvation of others as well. And I do that in the context of thinking about what Christ represents to me. And then because he's blessed me in a certain way, how do I now experience that in my community? A lot of people might imagine June 29th, 2023. In fact, I think that this may, in some sense, one day by future generations be called a day in social injustice infamy. This was the day that the Supreme Court made this decision that eradicated affirmative action in higher education, focusing on the process in 2 institutions that had been challenged, University of North Carolina, Harvard University, split decisions running down the court in terms of the conservative court, with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson abstaining on one of the votes, the one for Harvard, because of her relationship with their board. I want to start right there, though, because I think that Judge Jackson said something that is extremely profound in understanding the direction that we move. And some of you, I'm sure, have already familiarized yourself with her comments as it relates to this decision. But I really think that they are extremely important to how we think about this and how we move forward. She said, and I'm going to quote her, with let them eat cake obliviousness, today the majority pulls the ripcord and announces color blindness for all by the legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. No one benefits from ignorance. Although formal race-linked legal barriers are gone, race still matters in the lived experiences of all Americans in innumerable ways. And today's ruling makes things worse, not better. She went on to say the best that can be said of the majority's perspective is that it proceeds ostrich-like, with his head buried in the sand, from the hope that preventing consideration of race will end racism. It will take longer for racism to leave us, and ultimately ignoring race just makes it matter even more. So from the context of Judge Jackson's minority opinion on this particular ruling that really shook the foundations of higher education, I believe she gives us some insight as to where we land in this process. And what it's done for me is to help me think about where we go from here with this decision, because clearly the decision has been made, and the question now has to be, where do we go from here? And there are a few questions that I've come up with, because a lot of people, of course, have noted the fact that these admission processes can still include essay writing. I've kind of equated that to the Rooney Rule in football that says that teams have to at least interview one minority candidate when they're looking for a coach. It almost checks the box. It's like, okay, so what? You've kind of done it, and now what? With this ruling, the fact that people can still speak to their racial heritage and their cultural identity in their admissions essays does not necessarily guarantee that the doors will remain open, because there are a lot of narrow-minded people out there, and a lot of conservatives even, who are drumming the beat for moving things back from where they were and reversing decades-long experiences of how we have moved forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave in just a moment, but I want to leave you with just a couple of questions that I'm mulling over. And once Dave is done, I'll come back and share a final thought to kind of summarize where I think we go with this thing. Some of the questions that have come to my mind is, what does this decision do to DEI efforts being made in the workplace? And what impact will that have? Because a decision made in one arena easily stands the possibility of drifting into other arenas as well. And I'm very concerned about what happens in the employment space, the workforce space. Secondly, the question of, is there a role for HBCUs to play in this process? And I do believe that there is. I've talked to several people about this. In fact, one person I spoke to said that it's really flawed to think about HBCUs as picking up the mantle that's now been presented in this particular decision, because HBCUs are typically under-resourced and not as well prepared. And that's an excellent observation. But the other side of that for me then becomes, well, what do we need to do to position ourselves? And let's take the issue of what we've done for WJLU thus far. A concerned group of people heard about a concern. We put our minds and hearts together, and we came up with resources. So for me, the question isn't to look at what we don't have. To me, the question is to look at what we do have and then build on that. And I think that also involves working across lines of differences. So we don't just look at it as, what can the Black community do, but what can marginalized communities do? What can allies do who stand beside us in these kinds of conversations? And that, of course, is extremely important. And then the third question for me is, what is the role of the faith community in this particular time? As we stand back and watch what has happened with the Supreme Court, and as I stand here and say, yeah, there's a role for us to play in terms of HBCUs, and yes, there's a role that we need to consider as it relates to the impact on the workplace, I have to ask the question, what is the role of faith communities at this time? I have a few answers that I'll present, but I want David to go ahead and present at this time before I move forward.
Thanks, Kenny. So in my mind, what we're dealing with when we take a look at this, the Supreme Court ruling, and we juxtapose it with what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, particularly as it relates to the recasting, the most recent thing, which is the recasting of slavery as something that was beneficial, quote unquote, to Black people. And then we juxtapose that with what our U.S. Senator here in the state of Alabama recently was struggling with in terms of his embracing of white supremacy and white nationalism. And it seems to me what we're facing right now is a normalization and an attempt to reinstitute white supremacy as a codified part of U.S. culture and law. This should be concerning to all of us, because we know that if white supremacy is reinstituted culturally and if it is codified, we will be, once again, in a Jim Crow-like state in this country. And I know that seems far-fetched, perhaps, to some, to hear me phrase it that way, but I would urge you to consider each of these things that we've already cited and what they point to. And not just what they point to in terms of legalities and policies, but what they point to in terms of attitudes and the resulting atmosphere that is created by this. My friends Craig and Vicki Jackson know that my first wife was Michelle Sherman at the time, Sherman. And Craig and Vicki, I don't know if you know this story, but shortly after Michelle and I had gotten married, she began working at an elementary school in Decatur, Alabama, which is about 30 minutes west of Huntsville. And Decatur is to Huntsville culturally probably as, I'm trying to think of a good example here, probably as Los Angeles is to Orange County. Maybe that might be a good example. Conservative, traditional community, and so conservative and so traditional that it was commonplace for representatives of the daughters of the sons of the Confederacy, or I'm sorry, the daughters of the Confederacy, to go into the public schools. They were welcomed into the public schools in Decatur on a regular basis to talk to the young people there. So Michelle was teaching her class when a woman from the Daughters of the Confederacy came in for her appointed time. Michelle came home and told me how stunned she was and how angry she was that this woman began to tell the Black children that she was teaching that they should be grateful that their ancestors had been enslaved, because the enslavement of their ancestors saved them from a wretched life in some African nation in the bush or dealing with tribalism, and that it was slavery that taught them Christianity. Now, anybody who knows history knows, and Eric, you got to help me here because like you, I'm multilingual. I can speak in an appropriate way on the Sabbath day, but I also know how to speak in a way that harkens back to my South Side of Chicago days. So I'm tempted to go South Side of Chicago on y'all, but I'm going to try to keep it Sabbath appropriate here. That's a lot of foolishness, what that woman was saying to those children. But it's the same foolishness that Ron DeSantis has now codified in Florida. It's the same type of foolishness that was part of I think the logic of what our Senator Tuberville was dealing with. So I'm saying to you, I don't think this thing is as far-fetched as we may think, that we could be easing back culturally and maybe even in terms of policy and laws back into a Jim Crow-like situation. We have to be on guard. We have to stand up and speak. We have to continue to have conversations like this amongst ourselves, and we have to publicly challenge what's going on. We have to vote for the right people. We have to push and organize in every way possible to withstand not what is coming, but what is already here. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kenny.
Yeah, and I just want to ditto what Dave said. There was a time when I absolutely would not have accepted the premise that we could return to Jim Crow existence on a national scale. Like so many people would say, and living in Alabama for over 40 years, occasionally in these conversations, you hear people joke about the South will rise again and things of that nature, the bitterness that still is felt by some at having lost the Civil War. And I was like, that's just a relic of history. Not anymore. And I think that the Supreme Court has demonstrated that. If we go all the way back to the 1978 Bakke decision with the University of California, we saw where the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action. This 50-year journey that the Supreme Court has taken us on is something that is worthy of our understanding and study. We see the evidence of what's happening in terms of turning things back, not just in this affirmative action space, but we see it with abortion rights. We've seen it with voting rights. We've seen it with the Supreme Court decision on fundraising and the way that process goes about that disproportionately creates realities as it results to candidates' ability to be able to sustain their races for office. And as David said, that it's so important for us to think about these things on a regular basis. And so as we prepare to move to our next topic, I wanted to just leave a couple of things that I've been thinking about related to the questions that I raised. And David kind of started on part of that. So I'm going to start right there. What do we do as faith communities? I think Eric talked to us earlier about the notion of workforce development classes in faith communities and how we need to make those experiences that people are experiencing relevant to them every single day as a means of not just attracting them to the church, but as a means of meeting their needs. That was Jesus's ministry when he was here on earth, meet people's needs. And they followed him because of the love that he showed for them and his willingness to serve them. And so as faith communities, we need to educate people about the voting process and understand that voting matters. We need to help people understand that at the local level, local elections matter. People are getting all worked up right now about the slate of GOP candidates. One of them may win election for office next year. But the people that they really need to be keeping their eyes and ears on are the people at the local level. They need to look at who's the mayor of that community. They need to look at what the city council members are. They need to understand the school board, and not just from a distance, they need to go to those things. I think every faith community should assign somebody. Dave, you may want to mention this about something that's going on at one of the local churches here. Every faith community should assign a person or a group of people to monitor these experiences, not in a reactionary perspective or posture. We shouldn't just be in a position of just reacting to stuff that's going on. If we want to be a part of setting policy, we can't come up on the policy process on the back end. We have to join the process from the front end, which means that we got to build relationships with our elected leaders. And I want to include our local sheriff, our district attorney, because so many things that we get riled up about from the law enforcement perspective begins in those spaces. And it's important for us to do that. So faith communities absolutely need to invest more attention and interest in those things, and not just sitting around potlucks complaining about what's going on, but actually organizing and planning and creating strategies for success with intentionality that's going to bring about differences. Every faith community that has a bus parked on their parking lot should move those buses off that parking lot on election day. They should move into the community and make sure that people who can't get to the polls get to the polls. There should be, and that shouldn't happen. I'll use the presidential election since it's coming up next year. We shouldn't start talking about that in June or July of next year. The election is in November of next year. We know that. We can start talking about those things and strategizing on those things right now. That's also a great way for faith communities to partner with one another across denominations. Let's not worry about the fact that you represent this denomination, you represent that denomination. What we represent is the call for social justice for people in our communities, and we agree on that. So how can we leverage those resources in order to make things happen? Finally, I want to say something about the whole notion of what's happening in the workspaces. And what we fear at this point, and what we'll be watching in this space, is the widening of racial disparities in hiring as a consequence of the affirmative action decision. If you don't have people graduating from schools in sufficient numbers, you may not have the opportunity to move them into the workforce. So you should expect to see greater racial disparities as a result of that. You also see the threat, and this is in the workplace, the threat of decreased corporate commitments to DEI work. We know that since the George Floyd murder in 2020, that the investment of dollars and resources that were made at that time has significantly been reversed in some academic institutions, some corporate institutions, where people who had DEI officers hired at that time have no longer budgeted for those opportunities. We expect to see more of that happening, perhaps, as a result of this affirmative action decision. Also, what I would call performative DEI metrics. So you'll see people checking the box more. You know, you hear people talk about this now. Oh, we have a Black person working in the warehouse. In fact, we have a sanitation department here, and someone was celebrating the fact one day that one of the Black supervisors was in the sanitation department. I was just thinking about all the imagery related to that. I mean, I was happy for the brother, but I mean, I'm like, wait a minute, we got 27 departments, you know, and we do have multiple people of color in, I'd say maybe 20% of the departments, which is really good. But why not more? We have 30% here in the city, 30% African Americans in the city. We have about 7% Hispanics. So why aren't we looking for representation? We feel that the affirmative action vote may damage some of those things. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to digest. And we just wanted to share a few thoughts on that this afternoon. David?
Yeah, and before we transition into our next topic, what Kenny was asking me to speak about real quickly, I think, is the fact that my pastor, W. Snell at Oakwood University Church, has decided to make community engagement a top priority. And so I was appointed by the board as of January to serve a 2-year term as the director of community engagement for the church. And so keeping up with current events, trying to find ways to engage with the community on social justice issues, finding ways for the church to take a position on social justice issues is a large part of what I'm trying to do. And it's probably something that all of our churches should do, and maybe even our conferences and unions should start to consider. And I'm saying unions, and right as I said it, I thought that's not going to happen. But maybe some of the conferences may be open to that, and certainly some of our churches should be too. So our second topic today is domestic abuse, and I want to lead with a story. And this is part of a larger conversation about what some call church hurt. My pastor, W. Snell, calls it church trauma. I was in Walmart. This was several years ago, probably 10 years ago. I was in Walmart And I don't know about you, but when I go to the grocery store or to Walmart or to Target or Publix, wherever it is, my goal is to get in and get out as quickly as possible. I'm not trying to linger. I'm not trying to have reunion conversations. But one of the sisters of the church, older sister, at that time, I'm sure she was probably in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, approached me because she had heard me talking about one of my media projects on Kenny's show. And of course, you all know that Kenny and I, along with Preston and Stephen Foster and Dr. Keith Burton and others, are on the radio a couple of Sundays a month on Kenny's show on WJOU. And so I guess she had heard me talking about that on Kenny's show. This particular media project was about the case of Reese Taylor. So very tragic situation that happened here in Alabama in 1944. Mrs. Taylor was brutally gang raped in a city called, or in a town rather, called Abbeville, Alabama. And it made national news at the time. And if you Google it, you can get more information on the story. But anyway, saying all that to say that the sister who approached me was a deaconess at the Oakwood University Church, and someone I'd known for a number of years. And she began to tell me about how she was a domestic abuse survivor. And what was stunning to me was that she wasn't talking about something that had that was say in another life. She was talking about the husband to whom she was currently married, the husband whom I had known for many years. I was stunned by her candor. I was stunned at the nature of the story itself and what she described. And it was an eye-opening situation for me because it really helped me to realize that, and of course, as a grown person, married a couple of times, I've lived enough to know this, but it was a great reinforcement that we never know what happens behind closed doors. And just because we see a deaconess in her crisp white uniform or a deacon in his nice black suit and whatever tie he's wearing, it doesn't mean a thing in terms of what could be happening behind closed doors. This was reinforced to me again this week, just this week, when one of my schoolmates from Oakwood appeared on the podcast that Pastor Snell and I do that's called Breathe. And if you want to hear this episode, it'll actually drop in August. But one of my schoolmates, someone who I've known obviously for over 30 years, really closer to 40 years, was telling her own story about being abused by her husband, somebody, her ex-husband now, somebody who was a friend of mine, somebody that I'd attended church with, you know, and I knew them as a couple and thought they were a happy, healthy couple for years, watched their children grow up. And it was stunning to me to find out that she, and she goes into some detail on the podcast, what she was living with at home, unbeknownst to most of us. In fact, I was so stunned, I asked Kenny about it. I asked, did he know anything about it? And he said he thought he remembered hearing something. I hadn't heard anything. And we wanted to bring this to you today because we believe that this is one of the silent, I don't know what to call it, Kenny, diseases, conditions, challenges that afflicts the church and afflicts church people. And it's more common, I'm convinced it's more common than we realize. It may not always be physical abuse, it may be emotional abuse, it may be sexual abuse in marriages. And it's still stunning to me that there are men who think that they can't rape their wives. Of course you can rape a wife. That's a horrible thing to do, but of course it can happen. You know, it's stunning what people are living with behind closed doors, and we as a church and we as church members are often oblivious. So I'm going to end my comments by simply saying that I believe with all of my heart that this is something we must confront directly as a church. We must acknowledge the reality that just as there is a certain percentage of women who are abused outside of the church walls, there is an equal percentage of women who are abused within the church walls. And we do ourselves a disservice, and we do them a disservice, and we do the God that we claim to serve a disservice. If we are not acknowledging this and confronting this reality with all the energy that we would use to pitch a tent, or back in the day, do a revelation seminar or some other form of evangelism. As far as I'm concerned, evangelism to bring people into the Seventh-day Adventist Church means nothing if we are not evangelizing, ministering to the women and children and families in our church who are being broken by domestic abuse. I don't think I can say it any plainer than that. Kenny?
No, you really can't. And I just want to reinforce what you said and then just briefly highlight my 20 years working specifically in mental health counseling and some experiences that I had in that space. A lot of people don't often know that I am a licensed counselor and spent my first 20 years after college in that field and still maintain my certification with 100 hours of CEUs every 5 years. And so these, of course, are conversations and issues that are always very relevant to me. And it's one that jumps out at me, especially because of the fact that for years I've seen where our churches have nurses on duty on Sabbath. And so we're really prepared to meet people's physical challenges and physical needs. But what we really need to see more of, and I know some churches are doing this now, they're having social workers available for just like they have nurses assigned each week. They need to have a mental health professional assigned because they need to provide these opportunities for people to connect with them. Now, this is a 2018 Lifeway survey, and I hope and pray that this has changed since that time. But this survey showed that more than 30% of Protestant, and this is mind-blowing, actually, 30% of Protestant pastors believed physical and sexual violence does not occur in the church. That's from a 2018 Lifeway survey. Unfortunately, we all know that's not true, and it's hard to imagine how they might not know that that could be a possibility. You'd have to be, really out of touch, I think, to not understand that as a dynamic of life. The study goes on to say that studies have shown that Christian women are abused at roughly the same rate as those outside the church. And now here's where the rubber meets the road for this issue. The major difference is that Christian women are likely to remain an average of 3.5 years longer with an abusive partner, and they're more likely to return to an abuser after leaving. And the reason is because of the recordings that we have in our head about how we respond to marriage, how we respond to God. And a lot of people will excuse the heinous behavior of the abuser, not just with the hope that they'll get better, but motivated by fear, uncertainty, financial challenges, and more. Oftentimes, abusers will isolate people. Oftentimes, abusers will cause tremendous psychological self-destruction for a person so that they no longer have a sense of confidence in their own ability to just be a person. And so there's a tremendous amount of control exercised in that space. And to that point, I just want to share a brief thing that happened many years ago. We have a local domestic violence shelter here called Hope Place. And that was my go-to place when I was a counselor. I would refer people to this particular place. I learned just how devious the abuser can be from a situation that I had one time. My client was referred to Hope Place out of safety concerns, because for me, it's safety first over covenants, commitments, and marriage vows. I want to take the person out of that potentially dangerous space, and then we can reconcile things. I don't want my role was never to bring the couple back together again so we can work things out. My role was always to get the abuser fixed. If they were willing to do that, let's work on that piece first. Let's not establish any timelines. Let's see what kind of work we can get done and move forward in the process. I got my female client and her children in Hope Place. They were safe. One of the client's daughters looked up one day while they were at the facility, and the little girl called out, "Daddy." And the workers were stunned. They were sort of like, well, what is she talking about? They realized at some point that this abuser's husband had gotten into the shelter claiming that he was an abused man. And had it not been for the staff that jumped in at that time and was able to keep them separate and apart, that story could have ended in a disastrous way. Now, an even more disastrous part of that story is my client left the shelter and returned home to the husband at some point. The depth at which people are dealing with emotional stuff and emotional connectedness, emotional instability is rarely understood by people looking on the outside. People that say, well, why don't they just leave? Why didn't they just get away? It's just not that simple for any number of reasons. And it really behooves us as people of faith not to invade people's space, but to be mindful, to be helpful, to be resourceful. If we know things are happening, if we suspect things are happening, if you see something, say something. Those are important elements of this process. And from a proactive perspective, we need to provide safe spaces within faith communities and understand that these are ways that we can create opportunities for people to move and transition away from those dangerous places into something that's much more safe. But we can't do that unless we have relationships and have the knowledge about these resources that exist in town. Our last topic that we want to deal with today was a topic that our good friend Dane mentioned on last week, or could have been Eric. You guys are, two sides of the same coin for me. You're just my boys. No distinctions being made. You're just my boys. But I think it was one of you. It might have been Eric, but somebody mentioned talking a little bit about why. It was Dane. I remember now. Why do young people leave church? And of course, we knew we were going to talk a little bit about church hurt, and we knew we were going to talk a little bit about some of the dimensions of relevance and some of those kinds of things. And as I was talking to Dave about this, I said, Dave, one thing I want to ask, this is just a rhetorical question. How many of us really know from a quantitative perspective that young people are leaving the church, from more than anecdotal, where we kind of look around, we don't really see them there, And then that question made me think about another question. When we say that and suggest that young people have left the church, are we also suggesting that they left God? Are we saying that they left the church because we don't see them physically? And I really started reflecting on, I did a Facebook post a few weeks ago talking about my own personal relationship with the church right now, and I'm fully transparent. I have not returned to church since the pandemic. This is me personally. I've not returned because I spent 3 years taking care of my mother-in-law at home until she passed this past December. And my first response after she passed was not to say, oh boy, I better go check the box and go back to church. My wife and I are still going through a period of transition where we're still trying to adjust to the loss and deal with certain kinds of matters and certain kinds of things. And so I don't feel at this point that I've left the church, because I certainly have not left God, and God has not left me. In fact, I've shared with people, I have as strong a relationship with God today as ever before. And so I think it's important to acknowledge, yes, young people are finding challenges with relevance in terms of their participation in church. There's still some churches where people are finding ways to exclude young people from leadership. They're not mentoring them. They're not putting them under their wings and bringing them along. But I wanted to really dig into some stuff. And so I'm going to just share a couple of things with you all from a statistical perspective. Again, this was a survey that was done recently on the top 5 reasons young people leave church. The number 1 reason, because they moved to college and stopped attending church. So they disappeared because they had something else going on in their life that most people would understand is pretty significant. The second thing is church members seem judgmental or hypocritical. That was the number 2 reason. And of course, that's the one we tend to focus on when we start talking about why they aren't. I had a experience one time where a psychiatrist came to speak here in Huntsville about mental health issues and television violence. And he said something that has never left me. His name is Carl Bell, Chicago-based, Dave. Dr. Bell said, it's not the violence on TV that leaves the greatest impact on children. It's the violence in their homes. It's the relevance of their lived experiences on the street. We always want to find a scapegoat for something. Scapegoating began in the garden. Eve said it was the snake. Adam said it was the woman you gave me. We've been scapegoating ever since the garden. We always want to find some excuse outside of ourselves to blame for the reason that something is happening. So one of the first things any of us need to do, we're talking about young people leaving the church, is do some introspection. What's my relationship with those young people? Let me really try to understand what's going on in their life and experience. Let me look around and try to understand what opportunities, what real opportunities do they have to be connected? And here's the one for me where the rubber meets the road. The reason that I'm still connected to the church today and the reason that I'm still connected to God is because my family laid a foundation at home, not at church. The church experience was an extension of what was going on in the home. Family worship in the morning and the evening were tantamount to our existence. We didn't get away with that. It was something that happened and was made to experience life in a way that was friendly and loving and accepting. We shared with one another. We had a chance to participate. So when you saw me show up at church, I was just practicing what I was doing at home. That's why it's still with me today. That's how come the argument that was made a few years ago when they were talking about the 10 Commandments being placed on the walls. And people are upset because we can't place the 10 Commandments on the wall. I don't care. You can put 100 10 Commandments on the wall. If it's not in your heart, it won't even matter. And so when I look at this whole question about children and youth leaving our church and not being connected, the first question I got to ask is, they even connected at home? Why would they want to be connected to something externally if they're not connected to something at home that matters more than any, or should matter at least, more than anything else in the world? Seeing my dad carry his Bible was not enough for me to say, hey, I want to carry my Bible. Seeing my dad read and study his Bible and allow the transforming power of God in his life to impact the life of his wife and his children. So I watched my dad love his wife for 34 years until he died. That's how things happen in our lives. That's how changes are made in our lives. And when we look at children and young people, we have to understand that this is why. Reason number 3, didn't feel connected to people in my church. Think about how many times we pass young people up or talk about them if they do something wrong. Number 4, I disagree with the church's stance on political social issues. Young people today are more politically savvy than ever before. They are watching what's going on in the world today. And when your church is not addressing those issues and passing it on by, they're going to get connected with somebody who is addressing those issues. And then the last one, my work responsibilities prevented me from attending. Oops, we don't want to say anything about that because, you know, we just don't want to say anything about that. Dave?
You're getting a lot of amens in the chat there, Kenny. I want to come at this as we begin to close. I want to come at this from a different angle and a different perspective. And it's one I don't hear people addressing much at all, if at all. And that is the perspective of a parent whose child is no longer in the church. My son, whom a handful of you may know on this call, is a brilliant, sensitive, beautiful soul, smart, talented. Can't say enough about him. I love him dearly. And I thank God that we have a very close relationship to this day. In fact, he was on the call for a while. He had to jump off. But my son is not a religious person. And he first told me that he was no longer religious. I believe he was about 13 when he told me this. And we had a very interesting conversation about it because I wanted to make sure that he understood the terms he was using and the language and the concepts. But outside of that, we had maybe one or two other significant conversations about this, I'll say, call it a change in his life. And that was it. And the reason I determined that that was going to be it was that I decided for myself as a parent that the most important thing for me was not to debate my child, who's now, by the way, 28 years old, was not to debate my child, was not to fuss at my child, condemn my child. The most important thing for me to do was to make sure that my son knew that he was loved unconditionally by me. And that whatever he believes or doesn't believe is inconsequential as it relates to our relationship. Inconsequential. It doesn't define our relationship in any way, shape, or form. What defines our relationship is love, unconditional love. I believe that by taking this position, not only am I doing what's best for my son and myself, but I also believe I'm modeling what God has done with me. And that is loved me unconditionally, despite whatever I believe or don't believe, whatever I do or don't do. I'm a firm believer that if my son is ever going to change his mind about religion or about God and Christianity, that it's going to be something that happens between him and God, not between him and me. But I do believe that I can help the process by modeling for him the same love that I believe that God has for him and that I know God has for me. And by also respecting his right to have his own points of view, just as God has respected my right to have my own points of view and to make my own choices. Some of you may disagree with this approach, and that's fine. But this is the approach that I'm using. It's the approach I believe in. And I believe that ultimately only love can change hearts and minds. Not cajoling, not condemning, not arguments, only love. And so that's my position. And of course, I pray for my son every day, multiple times a day. And I believe that God loves him more, knows him better than I do, loves him more than I do, and that God will see to it, ultimately, that whatever needs to happen between them will happen. Kenny?
Wow, that's a great way to wrap up what I have been blessed with, a great conversation. I'm always inspired just being in David's presence. David and I go back a long way. And
Same,
I
brother.
know, yes, sir. I know my life is better because of him. I know that we've traveled some of the same paths, had some of the same challenges in our journey. We stood by each other's side for a very long time, and I'm just honored to be in this space at this time with him once again. I want to thank
Amen.
Eric and Dane, the Zoom family, for just welcoming us to this platform and allowing us a chance to be a part of this experience. And again, Dane, Eric, we've got confirmation to move forward with whatever you all decide to do in the future.
We'll
Thank you very much.
we'll have our legal department contact your legal department.
Your people can talk to our people, right?
Yes, our folks who don't have a retainer will contact your folks.
I got a couple of questions, and I know it won't be the end of it because when y'all come on, y'all just rock the house, man. It's like you put mac and cheese and sweet potatoes and collards all on the same plate. And a couple of things real quick. I am somebody that left the church that was dealt with only in love and never once condemned. If anybody knew Pops, never once condemned, cajoled, or beaten. Never one time. And I was gone. I'm done. I saw the duplicity. I saw the foolishness, because if you're PK, you get a chance to look up under the dress of the organization. And it's some foolishness. So when I came back to God, I came back via the 12-step program. I met God with a bunch of junkies and Narcotics Anonymous people. The God that I know today, that's where I met. And now I attend church for fellowship and whatever, but I'm not terribly concerned about what the GC says I have to do.
Preach.
Now that's
Preach.
just so, but I want to go back to something on the ESG side. When you were talking about the education, I live in the corporate space, have for 40 years. When I say this, not even slightly exaggerated, they hate educated Negroes. It was once the dividing factor. We can't let you in because you don't have it. All you Negroes went out, you got masters, you got bachelors, some of y'all got PhDs. When you walk into a room, they can no longer differentiate with the assumed greater intelligence. So if I was attacking that, and I don't know if anybody talks about it, but Marcus Garvey and all those guys that were revolutionaries, they were aided by journeymen and apprenticed skilled laborers that poured into those civil rights efforts. But in corporate, they hate. There's a lady on my floor, just got her PhD, very encouraging to me, trying to study again. She's a sister. They are now have to do something with her. They're in one role. She is overqualified. The person above her, of course, who does not look like her, is useless. Useless. We do have younger people in charge now who are not quite as violently racist and against minorities. They're still benefiting from it. But as the age gets a little bit younger, I do notice some different attitudes. Second point, and my cousin Donna put it in chat, where Ellen White actually predicts the South going back. And I don't know if anybody knows that the South, red states except for Texas, are all welfare states. They suck from the wealth of the blue states.
Yep.
Blue states have economies in them that make money. Red states, so they would like to dictate how we live, but it's like a teenager in your house telling you what's going to happen. They ain't got no job. That's basically where the red states are in relationship to everything else. So they hate California, sixth largest economy, I want to say worldwide, between 6 and 8 worldwide of all the countries. They hate it. Oh, they're liberal. Yeah, but because of them, your kids eat. They hate New York, same thing, financial centers. So in the real world, the ESG things that they're pushing back against, I don't see them going anywhere, because the younger investor is now investing not only rate of return, but investing his or her values. And I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on companies to deal with. That's why Disney has to go back up, has to go at DeSantis. These big companies have to respond that way because it's green dollars that they'll pay with if they don't. But I don't think the South is ever going to, like Donna said, I don't think it's ever going to back up off of the race slave mentality that's in there. Any points on that?
Yeah, well, I'll quickly say that you're absolutely right, because companies today, I would even say a majority of companies today, understand the bottom line with diversity efforts and inclusion and equity issues. They understand the bottom line is, if you are a for-profit company, it's that your company is profitable, and that the profitability of that company is contingent upon intangible things and tangible things. The tangible things clearly are the company's ability to earn and produce a product that people are going to buy and support and that kind of thing. But intangibly, we have to look at how do people within that space work together, because the fact that people in that space are able to respect one another, to be able to support one another, and to embrace one another lends itself to increased productivity, lower rates of turnover and burnout. It makes the whole space a happier place, and companies are actually looked at as companies that people desire to work for. And so you almost create a kind of competitive thing out there with people looking for companies that support those kinds of initiatives. And I know that I spent a significant amount of time trying to identify who those corporate allies are. Some of them are companies like Deloitte, Turner, Google, Meta. I mean, there are companies out there that, because I'm working with their DEI people internally and I'm being able to understand their corporate policies, their hiring practices, and more, that there are absolutely those partners out there. And I think we have to really spend more time investing in understanding the landscape as far as those companies are concerned, because people are leaving school today, or people are entering the workforce today looking for diverse workspaces, and they're looking for opportunities for promotion, and they're looking for, they're not there saying, well, I can't handle women's equality. The fact that we're talking about women's equality in 2023 is absurd to me. We should pay people what they are worth. We should pay people based on what they're able to do. There shouldn't be these huge inequities between gender as it relates to pay and things like that we're always talking about and arguing about. And I'm saying we as a society. And we got to note that these things are going on. It's the same thing, though, when you start talking about people of color. Let's not bring token people in, and let's not promote one person. So we got one person now. Let's promote people and give people opportunities based on their skills and abilities, rather than trying to reach some kind of a quota, using that word loosely, or check some kind of a box. And so that's happening out there. And I'm proud in some areas where it's happening, but there are definitely challenges out there. And the Supreme Court decision is going to create one of those challenges.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to add real quickly, Eric, that this is an old playbook that goes back more than 100 years. And for those of you who may not know this, Alexander Stephens, one of the founding fathers of the Confederacy, gave a famous speech, or infamous maybe is a better word for it, called the Cornerstone Speech. And this was in the 1860s, just in the lead up to the Civil War. And this is one quote that I've extracted from the speech. He proclaimed in this speech, "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." Fast forward about 100 years, and the governor of Alabama at the time was John Patterson. And John Patterson had the audacity in remarks that he was making in response to a brutal beating of Freedom Riders who arrived in Montgomery in 1961. Patterson had the audacity to frame the Freedom Riders as agitators, blaming them for the fact that they were beaten.
Mhm.
So he did not attribute the beating to the racism or the white supremacist views or the hatred of the attackers. No, it was the Freedom Riders who provoked them. This is an old playbook. And I think it's not, I think you're right, Eric. It's not going anywhere. The sentiment is not going anywhere. And certainly Ellen G. White was prescient, to say the least, when she indicated that at the very least, the spirit of slavery will return, if not something more.
Absolutely.
Hey, Eric, I have one more add to what you
Yes.
had to say.
Yes, sir.
And this is of tremendous interest to all of us. This week here in California, Dr. Tony Thurman, who's the California Superintendent of Education, was verbally attacked and kicked out of the Chino Valley School District Board meeting before its vote on parental notification policy regarding transgender students by a conservative group of parents. He was escorted out of the meeting by 4 security officials because he went over his speaking allotment by 2 seconds. He is the head of the education department for the state of California. And he was getting, I saw the video clip. If you guys want to look it up for yourselves, his name is Dr. Tony Thurman. He's the California Superintendent of Education. And the lack of respect and decorum at this meeting was absolutely appalling for such a leader who is an African American, by the way.
Of course.
And trying to hold and to provide a fairness in terms of the standards for what they're about to vote. But the disregard, when you say that things aren't going to change, folks, they aren't. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. I'm afraid it's out there for us. So I was just kind of, it's not really a question, guys. It's just kind of a statement of the times that we live and how sad it's become, and that we all need to pray for the situation, because I don't see it changing.
Yeah, real quick thing. People have a sense of entitlement today that I think is very profound in terms of how they respond to certain things. There is overall a lack of decency and respect for authority right now. That is being further eroded by as manifested in this evidence and a lot of things that we see through social media channels, legitimate and otherwise. We see it's common to look at school board highlights now, not because of the decision that was made, but because of the person who was acting out in that city council meeting or in that school board meeting or some other kind of town hall meeting. It's almost like in some instances becoming a badge of honor for some. But see, we also have to understand that people are feeling incredibly empowered now, especially from a defensive perspective. So one of the things I'm deeply concerned about are these laws of which our state is one, where you don't have to have a license to carry. And you know, it's almost like it's the wild, wild west now being sort of nurtured and cultivated because, you know, my presumption now, and I don't care what you look like, as far as I'm concerned, if I see you, you're packing. You know, I don't care how young you are. I don't care what race you are, what gender. As far as I'm concerned, you're packing. And you can almost see people sometimes sort of walking like they're posturing. And, you know, have you ever seen those YouTube videos about how people can hide 13, 14, 15 guns on them and you'll never know the difference? Understand, we see these incidents of road rage. We see these things happening in supermarkets and on the street. People are packing. People are restless. People are irritated. People are waiting for a fight. I was at a checkout counter about 2 years ago at Walmart, maybe 3 years ago. I was on the phone and I was putting my phone down as the cashier was checking me out. And I didn't hear what she said. So I said, pardon me. There was a guy standing next to me who looked at me and said, well, you would have heard if you hadn't been on the phone. And I looked to my left, really because I wanted to make sure, he wasn't about to go off for something like that. But it was a very uncomfortable situation that only made me understand that how we carry ourselves in public is extremely important. And our awareness of what's going on has to match that because of the conditions that we have right now. And these kinds of decisions are emboldening people and empowering people to take matters and take the law into their own hands. And I only expect to see more of that happening. What's happening in Florida with this new thing now, they've got a new thing every week, it seems. I say it's coming to a city near you. The state of Alabama, just this year for the second time, shot down a divisive concepts bill that will have similar consequences if it's ever passed. And I expect the legislature to bring it back again next year. And if it passes, it passes. And we'll see what happens. If it doesn't, I expect them to bring it back next year because elections matter and representation matters. That's why we have to pay attention at the ground level to these election processes.
Yeah, Ellen White in this quote says, "It's not leaving until they die." And that's a quote from her. That's a quote from her. Guys, you have blessed us again. I'm glad our legal departments will be talking to each other. I'm so looking forward to more of this. And you guys always kind of give us a direction, what to do, where to go. I like something that you said about while we're occupying until Jesus comes, we're to do the right thing. And so I appreciate that. I did want to throw out that the fastest, the demographic in gun ownership is African Americans. I don't know why, I just wanted to throw that out there. But I think Brother David and I understand exactly what that means. So God bless that one. With that, can I get the prayer request before I mess this whole thing up in front of Jesus? Where's my big sister? Okay, no less.
I'm praying for us all. If you are on the end of your row, please look to the person below you or above you. And if you are in the middle, look to the person to the right or left of you. And let's pray while the prayer requests are being written, and just take 2 minutes or whatever to ask the Lord that we never let go of his hand. Because in all that has been shared today, the only way we're getting through this is Jesus, period. Let's pray.
Storm clouds gather, billows of adversity. The tempest high, but it really doesn't matter. You're my strong arm against the enemy. I shall never let go his hand. Said I won't let go his hand. I shall never let go. Here's to Chandra right out.
My teens, yet I make you this commitment. For as long as you breath, I will breathe. I recognize the gift I have, you blessed me with it, to touch and heal all of humanity. Won't give up.
can't shake